first one is the research. This was unfortunately.
Yeah, tomorrow actually is another big event at CDC. Oh, very gorgeous. Another world. Working with there. Just a bunch of my friends. Like an experiential workshop, kind of vision, another world. Seven.
That's right.
Yeah, I got it.
You knew him very well. And you're still there.
Yeah.
Okay, you ready?
I'm glad I could.
Being conscious, So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to McNally Jackson. It's very nice to see you here. We're very excited this afternoon. We have a fascinating book to discuss. We are on the brink of an ecological mega crisis threatening the future of life on Earth. Between a manifesto and a plan of action, How Soon Is Now presents a compelling argument that humanity has unconsciously willed catastrophe to bring about transcendence of our current condition. Daniel Pinchbeck is the author of Breaking Open the Head and 2012, The Return of, I'm going to make embarrassment. Quetzalcoatl. Thank you. Please make Mr. Pinchbeck feel very welcome.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming tonight and joining me here. So I figured instead of reading, I'll really just talk about my work in the book, and then we can have a little time for Q&A, I guess. And I just realized that it's been a few months now since I've actually done a little talk about the book, so I may be rusty, but it'll all come flooding back. So this book actually is something I've been working on for like 8-10 years. I had a contract for it about 8 or 9 years ago and wasn't able to fulfill it at that point. And it was just stuck in my head as something that I needed to do and to complete. And the genesis, I really have to go back and explain my story a little bit, which is essentially like my first book, which is over there, Breaking Open the Head, came out in 2002. And that book was on psychedelic shamanism. And in the late 90s, I was working as a journalist in New York. I was a skeptic, a scientific materialist. I sort of went through a spiritual crisis or existential emergency. And at that point I remembered when I was in college that I'd explored psychedelic substances like mushrooms and LSD, and those had been kind of the only experiences that, for me personally, had been like suggestive that there was a lot that I didn't understand about consciousness, that there might be other levels of consciousness or psychic reality. So when I hit this existential emergency in my late 20s, I kind of spent some time looking at various options, and I just really remember those psychedelic experiences as these kind of talismans of some type of awakening. And I decided that I would go back and explore them. Since I was a journalist, I could then get essays, assignments to write about them. So I ended up going to West Africa, to Gabon, and visiting a tribe called the Bwiti, who use a substance called iboga, which is a long-lasting psychedelic, which is now actually being used in the West as a treatment for addictions under the name Ibogaine. And I had a very powerful initiation experience taking that in tribal ceremony. For another magazine, I went down to the Amazon. I visited a tribe in Ecuador called the Sequoia, who work with plant medicine, ayahuasca. I visited the Mazatec Indians in Mexico, where mushrooms were rediscovered in the 50s by the West. And I began to have a lot of different experiences that challenged my materialist paradigm on different levels that are all accounted for and described in the first book. Shamans would like tell me things from my past or about my ancestors that there was no way they could know about. I saw just synchronicities, telepathic foretellings, and so on. And over time, I began to shift from like sort of Freudian and materialist worldview to more of a Jungian perspective, and more of a perspective that recognized that this indigenous shamanism, these indigenous ways of understanding our cosmos had a lot of validity, and they've been sort of unnecessarily suppressed by the modern world. So that really led me on another level of inquiry, because I began to learn that a lot of these cultures had a prophetic understanding of the time that we're in now. Like the Maya civilization in the Yucatan saw 2012 as kind of the end of one long cycle, the beginning of another cycle. The Hopi talk about this time in Arizona, who were considered to be the first people on this continent, talk about this time as a transition between what they talk about as the fifth world and the sixth world. So I became fascinated, and also discovered a number of Western thinkers who were kind of sort of psychedelically inspired, who were also exploring this type of subject matter, like Terence McKenna and Jose Arguelles. So the second book maybe took 4 or 5 years for me to complete, and I was really looking at this idea of this prophecy and whether or not this is a time of extraordinary transformation, as these cultures say, and what that transformation might mean. And it was a very philosophical book. I basically think that when we step back, we can see these huge processes that are happening as signs that we're moving, from one kind of reality to another reality in a way. And among those things that are happening on a global scale is the rapid evolution of technology, the evolution of communications technology, the fact that we're all enmeshed in one global brain, like never before in history, and actually we can all communicate with each other, in an ongoing fashion, in a way that was never possible before. With that has come kind of a meeting of a lot of the world's traditions, like esoteric traditions. One of the things that I think suggests at this time is maybe distinct is the melding of the scientific worldview, the worldview of quantum physics, with what we can learn about from these esoteric and mystical traditions. That consciousness might be a deeper aspect of reality than what materialism says. It might not just be like an epiphenomenon of the brain, and maybe something that's kind of intrinsic to reality itself. And so along with those aspects, which are interesting and positive, is also the ecological crisis that's unfolding, and the kind of urgency around that. So as I finished the 2012 book, I guess I felt that I now had a sort of understanding. I did a lot of work around sort of metaphysical and metaphysical aspects and philosophical aspects of what was happening. But I felt, okay, let's say it's true. Let's take it as a kind of idea that the world is going through this incredible transformation. We're all somehow part of it. It's happening like in real time in our lives. Like, well, what is the possible outcome? Because most people, I would say most people have a very negative idea around the future at this point. Like, how many people here feel like sort of freaked out when they think about like what life's going to be like in 20 years or 30 years? How many people think that like we're probably going to go extinct, because we're destroying the environment and everything, And those are all real possibilities. Like if you look at what's happening, like we're losing, people know how many species we're losing a day according to estimates. It's like 150, 100 to 200 species a day out of like 8.2 million estimated total species. So that, means we're losing like, 10% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity every 10 to 15 years. Which is a lot to take in, right? And that's because of what we're doing to the tropical forests and what's happening to the oceans and so on. The oceans are, 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago because they're absorbing a lot of the industrial CO2 that we're emitting, which is leading to the coral reefs breaking down. I mean, there are all these feedback loops now that are happening and kind of accelerating. And of course, it's very hard for people to assimilate this and grasp this, because if you live, in New York or in the middle of what's, it's like our food is still coming. Like you can get a vanilla latte at Starbucks, or raw kale chips or whatever. It's hard for us to understand, to fathom and understand that these changes are happening at this incredible rate around the planet. But that's what all the scientific evidence is telling us. And of course, in the U.S., it's even more schizophrenic, because we have in power people who've even denied that there is a problem, or that the climate is changing. And we know that now there are over 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We know that 275 parts per million was what kept us at a stable climate. So where we are now, we know that eventually we'll have 40 degrees Celsius warmer temperatures, and sea levels will rise 50 or 100 feet or something. That's what we know from the records of the past. We just don't know what time scale that would happen on. So, rather than, and I guess part of what I felt my job or my journey was, in a way, was to sort of take an unflinching, stare into this stuff, and also envision, what we could do together, if it became a collective, realization on the part of humanity that we needed to work together to do something to ameliorate the situation. And so it really took me, and I think one reason it took me so long to write the books, it took me a number of years, but it's obviously a very big idea, and it took me a number of years even to think about how to think about it properly, in a way. And I guess the type of thinkers that became very powerful and useful for me were people like Buckminster Fuller, who's a design scientist, who was a systems thinker. He wrote a couple of books in the 60s. One was called Utopia or Oblivion, and another one was called Operation Spaceship Earth, where he really was seeing that, humanity had this capacity. We had the resources, we had the technical abilities to make a world that worked for everybody, but we were obstructed by our ideologies, by our political and economic systems, and therefore we couldn't have the type of design revolution that we needed to have to get everything into some kind of working order. And so, jumping off from that, I really began to think about what are the big pieces of that puzzle, I guess what the book proposes is that there's three main big areas that we need to think about in terms of how we would bring about this type of change that we would need at the time that's available. And one is just the technical infrastructure, right? In the book I focus on farming, industry and energy production, for instance, right? And actually, when you get into that stuff, there's a lot of reason to be hopeful and feel that we could really make tremendous changes, So for instance, with energy, there's nothing physically that's stopping us from transitioning to, basically 100% renewable energy in, 20 years, except for maybe the economic system and how work is structured in our society and what people are prioritizing and so on. But solar has reached grid parity with fossil fuels. We're seeing more and more innovation in that, and some people talk about the idea of a solar singularity, the point where and that's sort of happening. Huge solar farms are being built in China and Saudi Arabia. So that shift is really on the way. But it even needs to be accelerated much faster. In terms of farming, that's actually one of the biggest areas that causes global warming and climate change, and an area that we could address comprehensively. But would require a big shift, because over the last couple centuries with industrialization and modernization, we developed this model of kind of industrial farming, corporate agriculture, which is very destructive to the Earth's topsoil. So, even according to the UN, there's only about 60 years of harvest left the way we're producing food right now before the topsoil on the planet is so depleted that we can't grow food anymore. But there are other practices that can address that. So you can talk about regenerative agriculture, no-till farming, organic and permaculture, and there's a lot of innovation being done around that. But the thing about these other farming methods is that they actually require more kind of human input. They require more skill, they require smaller scale, and so on. And it would require a shift in our social priorities. If you think about the ideology of modernism, like the idea was basically, okay, like the countries are boring, it's boring to be like a rural person, everybody's gonna move to the cities, they're gonna like work in like advertising firms or in sweatshops, it'll be a much more exciting life, they'll all be entertained and so on. So that's been this underlying ideology of modernization, is move people out of the countries into the cities. That's what's been happening all over the planet. And in a sense, what I would argue in the book is that that doesn't have to be like the destination. Like we could actually shift our idea of progress, that we could actually say, okay, maybe we can resettle the countryside. We can retrain people to be farmers. And now with the internet, they don't have to be like isolated. There can be more communication, more travel, and these all these methods of farming that have been developed, which are more holistic and more beautiful, can spread. But it would have to be something like an engineer, almost like a socially engineered project at the scale that it would need to happen. And we'd have to break up these industrial monoculture farms and break them into smaller, like permaculture and no-till farming kind of ventures. I guess that's one thing in the book is recognizing that there's a lot of like ideology. Like we've unconsciously. We have a lot of assumptions about what progress is, about where things are going, and corporations obviously benefit from that, because there's this whole idea of not only corporate globalization, but technology and progress, and the future is going to be more technological, and there's the idea of the singularity, that ultimately our destiny is to merge with machines and so on. And so in the book I kind of interrogate that, take it apart a little bit, and argue that it's a different direction that we need to start considering, which is not anti-technology, it's not Ludditism, but it's recognizing that we need to be thinking about sustainable and regenerative technologies that are scalable quickly and globally. That's another piece of the puzzle, is if we actually are going to think about the scale of the threats that the ecological stuff is putting towards us. We're going to need exponential and scalable solutions. That can be implemented rapidly once the time has come, once people are ready to make that shift. And obviously it's not happening today, right now. So the part of the idea of the book is to get these ideas out into the public sphere. Get people having the time to assimilate them, and then probably in the next years there's going to be various crises, and the ideas that get applied, will be the ones that people are familiar with. So in a sense, part of the idea is to get a new set of ideas into people's minds and into the public sphere. That's kind of what I was trying to do with the book. So that was, so I talked about energy, farming, and then the other aspect of the technical infrastructure, we could say, would be like industry. Like at the moment, the way we manufacture things is very destructive. We're exploiting resources and so on, and that can also be shifted. And a thinker that I love, who I talked about in the book, is this guy William McDonough, who wrote a book called Cradle to Cradle, and he basically argued that we could redesign all of our ways of making things so that everything that we make feeds back neutrally or even positively into the environment. So even instead of now we talk about the idea of people heard the idea of an ecological footprint. We have a negative ecological footprint, everything we do is hurting the environment, but we could ultimately have a positive ecological footprint, and that's kind of his vision. Every footstep we take, 1,000 flowers and fruit trees could bloom, and he looks at that, for instance, think about wrappers, or this type of stuff. These could be compostable. They could have seeds. This is a water bottle, or a package for ice cream or something. It could have seeds and spores in it. So you finish the thing, you bury the wrapper, and it creates more plants or more gardens or whatever. Which is obviously basically what nature does. So I guess a lot of the focus of the book is this idea that we can learn a lot of things from nature's principles, which is what Buckminster Fuller talked about. He said that unfortunately, the way that humans have been designing is seeking to control or dominate nature's processes, rather than learning from nature and kind of imitating nature's processes in different ways. And then the other thing is I think that we have a lot to learn from these indigenous societies which have developed sustainable practices over generations that actually replenish and restore their local ecosystems. And I think in a way, we've had such a negative bias around tribal cultures, indigenous cultures, that that's also a big mind shift. But some of the crucial pieces of the puzzle for putting back together the planetary ecosystems are going to come from these indigenous cultures. Like an example is biochar. Have people heard about that? So essentially, what they learned about in the Amazon, like the tribal people who lived in the Amazon were actually very much like taking care of the forest. And the soil in the Amazon is actually very delicate. But they would do these kind of slow burning processes with biomass, with organic matter. They would kind of like wrap up and so on. And it would produce warmth, but it would also leave a carbon-rich tilth that they could redistribute on the soil. So it would actually make the soil more fertile. And so now different technologists are building industrial biochar systems so that we can use biomass in a way that on the one hand kind of creates energy, and on the other hand replenishes the soil and removes CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's something that could be scaled up globally. So there's a bunch of things like that that are quite fascinating. So yeah, so industry once again could shift to this cradle-to-cradle paradigm, where things are designed with components. I mean, there's a lot of destruction unnecessary destruction in the whole economic model that we have now as it relates to industry. It's like we have like planned obsolescence. Companies have to create stuff so that it lasts for a few years, then breaks down, right? Because then otherwise they can't sell you more stuff, right? So like, and many of the things we use require a lot of rare and precious materials. I mean, it's estimated that several million people have died in West Africa because of the conflict minerals that are what are used in our laptops and our smartphones, right? And meanwhile, we're just taught to use these things like they're garbage and you throw it out as soon as you used it, What would make more sense is if these companies built these things, that all the material could be recycled, and so that they're component based, rather than just get one piece and trash the whole thing. I mean, I don't know about you, but I have like 3 or 4 old like computers and old phones in my house, maybe more than that, maybe 5 or 6. I don't know what to do with them really, but the point is that it's a design problem, and just once again, it's a hard thing to shift in your psyche to think about it. But think about how many impossible things that we've already accomplished, right? Like, it seemed impossible that we could ever fly airplanes, and then the Wright brothers figured it out. The smartphone wasn't even conceivable, a generation ago, and now, it exists. So, in a way, I guess what I'm arguing for the book is if we shift our focus in these directions, it would allow us to make these types of transformations in our practices that seem very unlikely now from where we are now. Does this make sense to people? All right, cool. So that's kind of the technical aspect. So it's doable. Like we actually could, we may not be able to stop the seas from rising 50 to 75 feet, which may lead to coastal flooding. We may lose the coastal cities in the next 50 or 100 years. That may not be preventable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that life ends, I mean, if we were focused on kind of building alternatives, we could use almost that as an opportunity to create eco-cities, eco-villages further inland and higher elevation, I mean, many people when I start talking about this stuff are like, oh, like what about overpopulation? Like we have to reduce the world's population, but that's really not the point. I mean, actually, like it's estimated that 50% of the world's resources are used by the richest 1% of the population. So it's not really about population that much. It may be that we would want to slowly taper down the Earth's population. We certainly don't want it to happen in a violent and destructive way. And actually, populations reduce naturally when women are fully empowered. The more that women are given opportunity to work and their own supply of money and so on, they lose interest in being baby factories. And all around the world, the birth rate even goes beneath the replacement levels when women are more empowered in societies. So I guess in a way I would argue that the changes that we're facing in terms of environment and so on could be an incredible spur for innovation, for creativity, for an incredible human response that would actually be something that would be like a collective awakening and a shift into a more positive way of being. One of the main ideas of the book, I mean, as I mentioned, my previous works were very much about psychedelic shamanism and indigenous practices, is that we could look at the ecological crisis as a whole as something like a rite of passage for humanity, or like an initiation. And if we think about where we are now as a species, it's obvious that we're kind of somehow trapped into an almost like adolescent or immature state, And if that wasn't obvious, it's become super obvious at the moment, because like the person running the US is like a giant 4-year-old, and who represents a collective, shadow projection of the entire culture, And essentially in the book I talk about how, when indigenous cultures did rites of passage, I mean, we tend to think that, that their rituals were just like kind of cultural events, but actually some people have argued they might have something more like almost like a neurophysiological function. That actually, if you think about how we develop, like, we have a prefrontal cortex, which is the aspect of our brain that allows us to be human. We process symbols, we think for the future, we think abstractly, and so on. But it also kind of separates us into a very kind of individuated, egoic state of consciousness. And the rites of passage and initiation that tribal societies have, in a way, were culturally constructed kind of, efforts to force people out of that ego state of identity into like a visionary or transpersonal state. Through, could be fasting or walkabouts or some kind of ordeal, or psychedelic plants like peyote or mushrooms or ayahuasca, and or iboga. And for these cultures, you couldn't really be fully considered an adult until you passed through something like this, particularly for men, because many times they believe that women are a little bit more naturally indoctrinated by nature and their connection to cycles and so on. So and I really believe that this is the case. I mean, I really think that our culture is trapped because of this loss of initiation. And I got very fascinated by kind of Walter Benjamin's ideas around, like, he's a German philosopher. He was looking at the First World War, and he talked about how there's almost like, unless there's these kind of ceremonies of cosmic connectivity, that same energy gets like pent up and leads to destructive outbursts, like wars and and I see that even when we think about how long we've known about these ecological issues, and how we haven't really been able to redirect, our energies towards them. It's almost like subliminally we're forcing this, catastrophic episode to bring about our own awakening, our own maturing as a species. Does that make any sense? Yeah. Does it feel true to you? Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So I talked about the technical aspects, and the book goes into a lot of different areas. Of course, I really hope that you'll dive in and read it, check it out. And I know it's like it's interesting. When I wrote Breaking Open the Head and talked to audiences, I could feel this sort of cheerful excitement about the spiritual ideas and like the personal experiences that I had. And with this book, I can feel like the struggle, even in audiences, to kind of like hold these ideas, and that's very fascinating actually as the author to experience that. But so let me talk a little bit about the social aspects. So if we think about this, so I gave you the blueprint of what we'd have to change technically. But then we have a political economic system that's oriented against the type of transformation that's necessary, right? So like for instance, let's think about a corporation. In a sense, what is a corporation? You can think of a corporation as like almost like an artificial life form that humans have created. And it's an artificial life form that's made of ideas, it's made of legal code, brand insignias, monetary relationships, capital. And we've taken these artificial life forms and we've created a game called the stock market. And we say to these life forms, okay, we inject you into this game, and the only way that you win this game is you have to maximize financial profit and shareholder value. So it doesn't matter what else you do, just do that, So essentially what that does, it forces corporations to behave as they're behaving. It forces them to, buy politicians and subvert governments. It forces them to, undermine environmental restrictions and, lowball workers' pay and destroy unions. This is all built into the financial structure of how corporations have to operate to do what we've told them to do, which is to maximize financial value. So my perspective is that ultimately we're going to need to redesign the underlying logic of the financial system so that our constructions, our creations, like corporations, have to do more, than just maximize financial value. There's going to have to be a different approach to that. It'll be more like, different types of value: human value, environmental value, looking after local communities, the diversity of local communities. But to do that, obviously we're first going to have to, we're not ready for that now, like the corporations are running the show. It's going to require, a bit of a process over the next years to come to that realization collectively. So that, and then similarly, the economic system that we have, the money system, is also kind of inherently destructive, right? Like, it basically, our money is based on debt, right? It's issued into existence as bank debt. When somebody gets a loan from a bank, they're given a principal, and the bank evaluates their credit score and asks, basically, is this person, clever enough to go and compete against everybody else in society to bring back that extra money that's not part of that principal, the interest, right, that accrues. So then it forces a system of artificial scarcity and competition, and it forces a system of winners and losers, because either you're going to manage to succeed within the system, or you're going to go bankrupt. Be out on the street. I'm walking around New York. I walked down 8th Avenue the other night. At night, I don't know if you guys have done that recently, but man, there are a lot of people who have not succeeded in the system, and they're definitely pissed at this point. So we've constructed this situation where there have to be winners and losers. Where and then we've seen also over time the way the system works. Capital moves up the pyramid. So now it's estimated that 50 individuals, control more wealth than half the world's population, which is obviously totally unsustainable and crazy. So ultimately, we're going to have to rethink the medium that we use to exchange value. It's also going to have to be transitioned. I mean, I don't see how else we survive as a species. And the book is a wager, a thought experiment. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe I'm wrong. On every level. But personally, I think that why wouldn't we want to have this adventure of trying to transform the system that we've had so that it worked for the benefit of our whole human family and the community of life. Not just this tiny few at the top. So then, how would you do that? And there I looked at a bunch of different thinkers. There's one guy, Bernard Lietaer, who's a Belgian economist, who was one of the people who architected the euro. He wrote a book called The Future of Money, and he went through the whole history of monetary systems, and he found that there were actually different forms of money that actually had different behavior patterns and values kind of built into them. So he talked about yang and yin currencies was the basic distinction that he made. And what we have now is a monoculture of a yang currency, which is purely masculine values. It's acquisitive, forces competition, forces domination, and so on. But he noted there were also these yang currencies, the community currencies in Bali, in Japan. He points to an example called the Furyo Kipo, which means a caring relationship ticket, where you could take care of an old person in your community, you get some credit, and then you can give that to somebody else to take care of your son or child in another community or whatever. So he proposes that you could have, for instance, a global trading currency that has a negative interest charge, a demurrage charge. Essentially, it has a timestamp. We have an exchange, I give you 100, it's called Terra in this system, I give you 100 Terras, and as soon as you get it, it starts to degrade in value. So you have no impetus to hoard it, your impetus is to get it back into circulation, to share it with other people. And along with that could be other ways of exchanging value, local exchange, trading systems, where groups of local manufacturers, service providers, share value in a sense. So that's some of the economic stuff that I discuss in the book in more depth. And then obviously, we have the problem of governance, and clearly, we can see that we're going haywire right now in that regard. And I think once again, we have to step back and think about how we got into this pickle, and why we're in this pickle and how we get out of it. We have to use our creativity and our intelligence to kind of look at the problem. And if we go back, we could say this type of government that we have now was created in the late 18th century, after the French and American Revolution. And it was developed at a time when information could only move as fast as like a schooner ship or a horse and buggy. It was developed for a very different time when the rate of change wasn't as fast as it is now. And when we didn't have the communication capacity that we have now. And if we even step back further, we can see that there's like a whole history of connection between the evolution of media and the evolution of political systems. So you could never have had an empire like Rome without a written code of law that spread a certain level of homogeneity, homogenization across a long area. You could never have had America or France or England in the current way they're constituted until you had a printing press, so people could get enough information about current events so they could vote, in some quasi-democratic way. So I think in theory, with the internet, it points towards a totally new way that political power could be organized. We could have something more like a direct democracy where people are not just allowed to vote every 4 years for one of two very compromised candidates. They could be voting continuously and learning continuously. And in fact, some people have been trying to create such a system. A group in Argentina created a platform called Democracy OS. And so the idea there is, there's all these different issues. You can vote in all these different areas. If you don't know about an issue, you can give your vote to somebody that you trust who maybe knows more than you. So if I don't know enough about water, I can give my vote to, what's your name over here?
Dwight.
Dwight. I can say, okay, Dwight, you're an expert on water. I'm giving Dwight my water vote. And then, he gets to make decisions on water. Then a few months later, if I learn that Dwight is getting a kickback from Pepsi, I can say, Dwight, I'm taking my vote away, and I'm giving it to, what's your name over here?
Mark.
Mark, So that to me would be so much more, sane. It would require, once again, more effort, more kind of work on everybody's part, but it's the only way we could actually, I think, have a truly democratic system. So those are, some of the basic ideas in the book. And then the third area, so one area is like the technical side, like farming, energy industry. Another area is the social side, government, economics. And then the third area is like consciousness, I guess. Because how consciousness is constructed determines the types of behavior patterns and habits that everybody has. So I got very excited about this idea from this Italian political philosopher Antonio Negri, who talks about this idea of the production of subjectivity. So the way that we are indoctrinated into our present system, everything tells us that we are rebels. Just do it. As the Nike ad. That we're like totally on top of it. Like we're the ones making decisions. And so on. But actually, it's a very skillful system that's produced a certain type, or let's say level or frequency of subjectivity. And the media is like a system that constantly reiterates our relationships to one another, or how we think that relationships, love relationships are meant to be, how we think we're meant to relate to authority and so on, and also what we buy, what we value and so on. So ultimately, if we were going to make a systemic transition, we would have to produce a different form or level of subjectivity that would be more participatory, more aware of its connection to the environment surrounding it, more plugged in ecologically. But I think that can be done. A huge amount of force and effort has been exerted to create this type of artificial situation that we're in now. Apparently the average American can identify less than 10 species of native plants and more than 1,000 corporate logos. So we basically substituted a natural, organic reality for an artificial, corporate-defined reality. But that doesn't have to be the endpoint of this program. We could, in a way, move in a different direction. And the same media that's been used to kind of disempower and control people's minds, could be applied in a different way to liberate them and to reconnect them, to the world around them. So that's some of the ideas in the book. So I guess from my perspective, it's difficult, and I know it's a lot to take in, but if we were to say to ourselves, And here I think why I think it helps to have a spiritual practice, to have gone through a consciousness awakening, is then you can say to yourself, okay, like this is like the great mission, like this is the great initiation of our time, this is the great opportunity spiritually. This is like, we're in like Star Wars or Avatar or The Matrix, like all of the movies have been like preparing us for this moment. And and it's actually quite incredible if you think about it, like, like Steve Bannon, who's Trump's chief strategist, has openly in interviews said that he really identifies with Satan and Darth Vader. If you go to like the Hollywood Reporter interview with him, I mean, it's unbelievable. But I think, of course, it was kind of tongue in cheek and like whatever. But still, to say that, is telling us something that we are in this time when these archetypes of the collective psyche have been activated in a very profound way, and maybe the Jungian perspective. And and hopefully we can rally to look at it in a different way, and then find a way for humanity to collaborate on bringing about system change. So yeah, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I'd love to hear some questions if you have some. Yeah.
So you're making a lot of references to current state of American politics. I am not American, I'm Canadian. So not everything, not all the problems that you describe are exactly the same all over the world. I'm wondering if you, in your travels, and it does seem like you've traveled a bit, have been to anywhere where you think they're actually going in the right direction, or at least more so than anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, Canada seems better, Scandinavia seems better. Still, I sort of feel that ultimately it's going to be a deeper level of systemic change, and that's going to really involve, I feel that we haven't really unleashed our creative capacities as a species yet. And it's like we're in this holding pattern, and in a way we force this crisis to do that. I mean, that's my intuitive sense of the situation. And yeah, I mean, it may look different in different places. And the U.S. has been such a crucible of this post-industrial empire building and so on, and it's kind of like, I personally really was not a fan of Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama at all. I felt that they were just shills of Wall Street and the military-industrial complex, and I don't feel any sadness that they're off the stage. But I think that what's happening now, as horrible as it is a tremendous revealing, for the world. And yes, these things are at their most extreme form in the United States, but it's part of every system. I mean, Scandinavia, some of that wealth comes from exploitation of the developed world, developing world. It's a universal situation. Yeah.
What about Bhutan?
What's that?
What about Bhutan?
Yeah, no, I haven't been to Bhutan. I mean, there are a few intact traditional societies on the culture on the planet that I think we're going to be looking, we should be looking at as potential solutions. I mean, in the book, and they were very, they were lucky that they were able to kind of circumscribe their borders and keep the outside influence to a minimum, partially, ironically, because they had this kind of monarchy and so on. In the book, I talk a little bit about Ladakh, which was a Tibetan Buddhist area in India. And there's a woman I'm friends with, Helena Norbert Hodge, who has a whole kind of institute around localization. That's her big theme. And she was an anthropologist. She went to visit Ladakh in the 70s, and she had a Western superior attitude about it. She didn't expect to be, she thought that she was bringing, this higher level of intelligence to it. But when she hung out with them, she was like, wow, this is a beautiful society, and in so many ways it's far more advanced than my society. And her whole perspective changed, and the people in Ladakh, they don't even have titles to their homes. Like people just lived in their homes for generations. They have a local culture that was very dear to them. Like they would sing songs together and pray together. If somebody's house burned down, they would all come together as a community to rebuild it. She was blown away by the beauty of the culture and the depth of it. But then she saw what happened over the next decades as India modernized and got sort of infected more and more by the Western, capitalism bug. It basically has been like a corrosive force, like an acid that's been breaking apart this culture in Ladakh. And now she says the kids are sniffing glue and they just want the next pair of sneakers and so on. yeah, it's hardcore what's happening out there. But yeah, you know, ultimately we you know, and that's also the values. Like when you have such a powerful media machine as we've created, that's just indoctrinating people into this system of values. You know, we ultimately need to build an alternative media machine that I'm sure you know very well, that is putting out a different set of values and valuing local communities and local difference and local traditions and local spirituality and local ecology and all things they were already doing. You know, it's almost like we need to like turn the engine around, you know, kind of indigenize and shamanize the Western industrial machinery that we've created. You know, and then there are some things like, you know, once again, I'm not to you know, I'm not against technology. You know, I think you know, but I think that it's, you know, it's in a dangerous trajectory. You know, like so like now they're talking about, for instance, to deal with climate change, geoengineering. You know, which I think is something to be very, very suspicious of. You know, so one idea is that one way to cool the planet, do people know about this, is to pour huge amounts of sulfur particles into the upper atmosphere. You know, and that's called global dimming, because that sulfur actually, you know, reduces the sun's rays, so it'll be less bright on the planet. I mean, what an image that is. And the problem is that you have to then keep putting the sulfur into the atmosphere year after year, and you know, it'll lead to changes in the environment. Like some areas will become have much more droughts. A lot of Africa would probably become a total drought, and so on. You know, so that's a terrible solution. But you know, you can see it. It's like it's moving from the periphery into the mainstream, and as things get worse, you can bet on it that that's going to become bigger and bigger thing. But you know, that sounds horrible. But I mean, I have another friend who worked at Google who has a company which is basically using drones to plant forests. They can plant like millions of trees in like a few days now, you know. So that's an incredible use of technology, you know. So yeah, so it's like, you know, it's like from our hyper technological perspective that we're in now, how do we find the sustainable and regenerative potential, you know. Another very interesting idea or project is called Regen Villages. The Stanford University professor has developed these modular housing units that have aquaponics units built into them, renewable energy systems incorporated with the solar and composting and so on. So you know, you could sell these through Walmart. You could mass manufacture, distribute them, and we could use the factories for doing something like that. And you know, they can be distributed to refugee populations who are kind of like on these edge zones of the planet right now, so that they could actually be able to take care of themselves. You know, but it's yeah. So I mean, I think a lot of stuff like that is going to become possible in the next few years. I mean. Yeah, another question? Yeah, hi George.
Hi.
George lived below me in my dad's building in Soho for many
He
years.
still lives there.
Yeah, he still lives there, yeah.
I just wondered if you'd expand a little bit about the influence of Jung on your thinking here.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very sympathetic with Jung. I mean, I think that, you know, Jung was like the great 20th century Western shaman, and he kind of integrated, sort of esotericism with a psychological depth perspective. And for me, you know, I mean, you know, any system of thought is just like a map, and no map is perfect, right? So and I think that's one of the key things in a way to make this evolution of consciousness that's necessary, is we tend to get so locked into our maps, and particularly the 2012 book, I looked at a lot of people who I felt their maps were quite similar, but you know, you're right, like Rudolf Steiner and Carl Jung, to me there's a lot of overlap, but you know, people who are Steiner-ians or they're Jungians, you know, and actually I think that's silly. We have to recognize that these are just maps that are useful when they're useful, you know, so Jung's ideas around like the archetypes and the collective unconscious, you know, there is a collective psyche, that how archetypal material emerges, you know, actually into the reality that we share. You know, his idea that actually we're activating like the archetype of the apocalypse, you know, and so many other aspects of his thought, I think are profoundly powerful and healing and helpful. You know? Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how you kind of ritualize the shift in consciousness to bring it to a group level. We move towards more secularist thought here and individuation. And I find a lot of the Eastern thinking is about digging into the self. I'm wondering how you talk about Star Wars and that kind of like a thinking in terms of like almost gaming the change and getting like the feeling of adventure out of it. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how to get just like kind of rituals for the daily life that can empower the shift that needs to come and build communities in the process, you know? Makes sense.
Sort of. I mean, yeah, but I've had a few people who want to create, like we've seen the powers be like Pokemon, you know, like suddenly billions of people playing some game. Like what if we were using this technology to have people, you know, relearn, you know, what their native plants are, you know, or, you know, volunteering together to remediate local water systems or something. And stuff like that would be really fascinating, you know. Or creating like, you know, I mean, you know, mediated, you know, rituals also, like you could have like, you know, I mean, there are some of them, you know, unify global citizens, trying to do stuff like that. I don't know, I don't think I've answered your question, I just look up for a brow.
No, I'm trying to process it. It's a little still. I realize it's hard to clarify. Yeah, I guess that works. I'm trying to say like people find rewards in these very basic things in the materialism, and we're trained to think that way. So the shift in subjectivity takes a long time. It's like how do we find little ways of creating the community and the feeling of accomplishment moving forward as a group. I don't. Yeah. I'm swimming out there.
Keep swimming.
Yeah, maybe to actually kind of piggyback on that,
Yeah.
if I'm hearing you correctly, maybe it's like, what does it look like to shift sort of, you know, collectively to you know, political economic systems that aren't just like based on resource scarcity, but like you were saying, like, I mean, if we're moving towards sustainability, that's completely antithetical to these ideas of our current economic system as that.
Yeah, well, I mean,
feel.
yeah, I mean, one idea that's getting more and more traction is the idea of like a basic income, which I think Finland is now experimenting with. And, you know, that to me is definitely the future. I mean, some form of it, you know. Like automation is, you know, growing rapidly right now. You know, and one way that Trump won this election, you know, if you call that winning, is by promising to bring back like, the golden age of industrial era jobs, you know, like, but we know that's not really going to happen because, you know, there's more and more automation. Like, you know, I was in a Tesla, which is like already had a self-driving feature a few days ago. Like you go on a highway, you just do your emails and the thing drives itself. You know, within a couple of years, there's going to be self-driving vehicles, you know, that are going to be readily available. But what's the largest workforce in the U.S.? Truck drivers, 3.5 million truck drivers. So those people are going to be more or less out of work, you know, unless you artificially keep those jobs available. But that's happening in a lot of different fields, even like journalism, you know, and medical technology, medical imaging, and so on. So, you know, we need to rethink, like we need to, in a way, begin to think about a post-work society that is really oriented towards taking care of people properly and maybe allowing them to live in, you know, multi-generational or supporting them, let's say, living in multi-generational communities where they, you know, where they create more of their own food, more of their own energy, that are based on creating resilience, because the ecological crisis is going to deepen. I mean, even if we start doing all the things that I talk about in the book tomorrow, you know, eventually, over the next decades, things are going to get pretty raw, and the best thing is going to be for, you know, local communities that are highly resilient are going to have the best opportunity to make it through the changes that are happening. Yeah, there's another piece of that, but yeah, go ahead, in the back. No, you, yeah.
In your travels, have you ever come across a culture, or in your studies, where women have been compensated for motherhood? This has been an idea that kind of, that I've been wondering at some point, that trying to trace back when really did we disenfranchise mothers. Obviously in modern society we can point to all these reasons why we lose out on women's talent, right? But in history, has there ever been a society that really like rewards motherhood and that structure?
I think there were societies where, you know, women and mothers were given a much higher status in a way, but, you know, they might not have had the same economic compensation mechanism that we had. You know?
Yeah, I only ask because I think that we talk about, obviously, like empowering women helps the economy, helps balance out certain, you know, kind of like these self-involved agendas in ways that in Jungian, like masculinity,
else to add to that. But yeah, I mean,
It's a governance change, basically, is what it boils down to, is my question.
and how to value motherhood as a.
Well, how to economically, value motherhood and return women to the workforce in a way.
Well, okay, I guess in the book I look at it more from a different angle. And there's a whole chapter section on sex and love, and I visited a community in Portugal a number of times called Tamara, you know, they're basically, you know, were started by German radicals who'd gone through the movements in the left in the 60s and 70s, and they were trying to figure out why these utopian ideals that were in these movements never really got traction, like never came to fruition. And they actually began to analyze it, and they began to realize there were core issues around love and sexuality, like jealousy and possessiveness, that were underlying critical issues that people weren't really able to address properly. So they created like a sort of incubation for a new social design, which is based on non-possessive, transparent relationships that are rooted in trust and authenticity. And they have a lot of social tools that keep the community able to relate like that. And they have circles every week called forum and so on. But one of the obvious and key things is cooperative childcare, right? Because the nuclear family, the monogamous couple model for childcare is really terrible. I mean, in terms of the amount of effort it takes for a person to raise a child, and if it's more community based, then women are much more liberated. So like after the age of like 2 or 3, a lot of the children in Tamara will actually live in a central area, like a children's compound, where different members of the community will look after them. They can still see their parents like all the time or whatever, but it's not like, every time the kid has to go to Washington Square Park, you have to like walk the stroller and sit there staring at to space for 3 hours. I mean, this is like a terrible social design. Like community, tribal structures, I believe, are much more intrinsic and healthy for human beings than what we've created now. That's my perspective. Yeah.
Just in response to that, if I may, you asked when did motherhood become devalued? When GDP became, when product, money, GDP became more valued than life, motherhood got devalued. When life was more valued, then mother was the creator of life.
Yeah. Well, GDP is definitely a horrible measure of progress.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, also,
Yeah.
I was trying to think of a question, but I agree with you so much that I can't come up with a question. So may I just give a perspective?
Yeah.
I agree with you 100% about the ritual, the youth ritual into manhood, was always a context of existential truth, a fear of survival. And in that context, it broke the chain of conditioned thought patterns that were perceived as what truth was.
Yeah.
Beliefs. And I believe the future, I'm betting on the future being the awareness of our own neural truth as being the way back to the circadian experience of life as existential truth.
I like that. That's nice. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, you say at the end of your talk a lot of possibilities in energy industries, a consciousness change. I just kind of ask, like, at the moment of the 70s, the late 60s and 70s, you already have a certain awareness of the planetary awareness, environment, feminism, you begin to get gender rights. So if that, it's almost 50 years old, right? So why didn't that become the point of manifesting the things that I think many of us knew in the 70s that you speak about? Why didn't that
That's a
take off?
very good question. I mean, I tend to look at the 60s as the kind of first stage of a kind of initiation process for the modern world. And so, for instance, with the psychedelics, there were no elders around who'd gone through those experiences. So, like Timothy Leary had only done psychedelics for 2 years. Like he started doing it in 1960 when he was 40 years old, where he was suddenly like the guru and the go-to guy for psychedelics. He really had like very little experience. And so it was like a first stage of an initiation process. And essentially what happened is the society kind of suppressed a lot of the, you know, evolutionary potential, you know, and also there was so much also kind of fat, I guess, in the system. You know, so like you were given a choice, you could be like a, you know, hard-nosed radical and grub out an existence at some dirt farm in Vermont, or you could become a marketing executive, you know, for Rolling Stone and, you know, live a glitzy life and party at Studio 54, you know, and you know, and they also showed things like Kent State and the assassinations that if you don't toe the line, you know, you may end up just fucking dead because we're going to shoot peaceful protesters and, you know, shoot anybody that's of great leadership quality. You know, they made that pretty clear, you know. So, so then I think a lot of those currents that kind of have gone underground, you know, and feminism has taken new and different forms. You know, I think also like, yeah, there's issues around the relativism of a purely secular kind of perspective, you know, which is also broken into like these identity politics and deconstruction and stuff that really isn't very healthy thinking or very productive. And I think that once again, we're forcing ourselves into a kind of creative catalytic crisis to really bring in the paradigm for what has to be for humanity to go forward from this point, you know.
Don't you think that the certain amount of like the deconstruction and the postmodern relativism, you know, once we saw the failure of modernity and universalism, it's kind of hard to kind of, and then the ecological agenda is the overarching mythos that we could all embrace. You know, it just doesn't seem to kick in. We have this insane return to national digging in. I mean, I guess everybody wants to know if this is the last throes of this insanity, of chauvinism, whatever it is, or are we going to get past this, or is this just going to give us the totalitarian state of extreme fascism, and your stuff will just be like dippy and forget it?
I can't answer that.
What's
that?
That's your choice.
Yeah. I mean,
well, it's not
you know,
really, that's kind of
I feel like, I mean, on another level, from more like a sort of Vedantic, like mystical perspective, like it feels like we've entered into like a mythical reality right now. Like there's something like very like you know, Trump, you know, the name Trump, that he trumped the system. You know, his Secretary of State is Rex Tillerson, T-Rex, you know. The woman who just blew the cover, you know, of whatever it was, the Russia hacking stuff. You know, what's her name?
Reality winner.
Reality winner. And that's her actual name. You know, so like, I feel that we're like, you know, we're being given deeper and deeper hints that we're actually in like a cosmic illusion. You know? And there was a really great, this guy Jonathan Zapp wrote some beautiful pieces for this web magazine I started, Reality Sandwich, about how Trumpocalypse reveals that we're actually living in a matrix. And I really felt like I couldn't disagree with him at all. And you know, one thing he pointed out, that if this is like a cosmic illusion or matrix, and maybe it's like a game show that's being watched by, you know, extraterrestrials or from another level, you know, well, how do you win a game? You know, in this sense, you become like a story intensifying character. You know, like the plot has intensified. You know, like the story is intensifying, and maybe that's part of how it goes right now. I don't know. I don't know if we get back. You know, I don't know if this. You know, I guess I do tend to think, whether it happens in my lifetime or not, but you know, it seems like we might be moving towards like a Berlin Wall moment. You know, even if people are, you know, speaking, you know, even for the Trumpians, like it's so obvious that the whole system is moribund. You know, it couldn't be more. It's just, you know, even if subliminally, even if they're consciously still speaking whatever they're speaking about liberal politics or Republican politics, on some subliminal level, everybody must be reaching this collective awareness that this is junk, you know? And that's what happened with the Soviet Union. Like if you look at like the 1970s or 80s, you know, you didn't have people saying, oh, like, guess what, in a few years, the people are gonna rise up, they're gonna go to the wall, they're gonna tear it down by hand, nobody's gonna shoot them, and that'll be the end of the Soviet Union, you know? Nobody had that idea, you know, and it happened, right? So there's kind of like Berlin Wall moments, you know, where, you know, things that are impossible happen because on a subliminal level, it's time, you know? And I feel that something like that could be emergent, you know. But that's also why I felt the ideas in this book were very important to get out into the world, because look what happened with the USSR. Like, you know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, you know, these economists from the Chicago School, like Milton Friedmanites, rushed into those countries and said, you know, okay, what you got to do now is privatize all your resources, you sell them to the highest bidder, and it created this oligarchic, you know, plutocracy, which they have now. They actually prepared that. Like, you know, if you read Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, like, you know, she looked at Milton Friedman actually said, like, years earlier, well, you know, so they were like, in the 60s and 70s, there were these right-wing economists, and they wanted privatization, they didn't like the Great Society, the liberalization, and better education, they wanted to roll it all back. They're like, okay, like, this is not our time, like, nobody's ready to listen to this right now. So what we have to do is we have to create a set of institutions, like think tanks, magazines, academic departments, get these ideas out there. And Milton Friedman even said that when a crisis comes, the ideas that get applied are the ones that are lying around. So our job is to get those ideas out, have them ready to be, you know, propagated or instituted, and that's what happened with the Soviet Union. So, you know, if we see that a crisis is almost, you know, how could it not be inevitable at this point, you know? And in a way, like, I feel that Trump is a great accelerator. Like, when Trump is like, his people are like, oh, like, we're going to repeal the Glass-Steagall Act, you know, we're going to liberate the banks from all these restrictions. I'm like, great guys, like, go for it, you know? Like, bring it on, because that's going to accelerate a crash. And we need a crash so that we can break through, you know, somehow. Way in the back. Guy with the hat, red hat. Red hat, red hat. Okay. Oh, it's Bob Eisenberg in the back.
I was just going to say, you're talking about changing the logic of corporations, the fundamental logic of Marx called the engine of accumulation. They're all about accumulating. It's a very powerful purpose that you can't deviate from. You know, today the head of Australia's biggest oil company said that their strategic model takes into account a 4 degrees Celsius rise in global mean temperature. They're going to continue operating as a profit-making company when half the world is dying of famine. That's in their corporate model. How do you argue with logically? It's so powerful.
Yeah, no,
Like
it's
Lenin said,
a bad situation.
Lenin says a capitalist, as you know this statement, and I'm a democratic socialist. I'm not a, you know,
Yeah.
but Lenin said that a capitalist will sell the rope that will be used to hang the capitalist if you can make a profit on selling that rope.
Yep.
So isn't what we're saying is that actually capitalism is an ideology, just like a religion. It's
Yeah.
a religious ideology.
Mhm.
So what we're talking about is deconstructing, which is what your book is doing, and also starting reconstruction. We need to reconstruct new notions of what it means to be human, connection, and that's our job.
Yeah.
And I sometimes get really frustrated in a lot of the circles that I'm in is that we don't talk about models enough. It's great to talk about concepts and little ideas from one country or another country, or, you know, refer to the indigenous world. They fucked up too in many places. We need to really think about models and come together and think how we're actually reconstructing new models. Because there's no doubt we're in a massive civilization paradigm shift, a Copernican shift that takes a long time, and no one in a paradigm shift can shift to a new paradigm unless it's already constructed, unless there's models. You have to be able to go into the models. So yeah, I mean, I think if we actually start to look at capitalism as a religious ideology, that's extreme. It is extremist. It is not the terrorist fiction that is killing us. It's an ecological destruction at scale that is legalized. It's legal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one way or the other, it's going to come to an end. But hopefully, it comes to an end through, yeah, like a alternative paradigm becoming, you know, available, becoming collectivized, you know, becoming something that people can enter into.
Yeah, but I think we have to
And
be
I see a lot of
concrete
people.
about it.
What's that?
I think we have to be really concrete about it. The problem is in the West, it's in the Western mind, it's colonized for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
We don't have an imagination to think outside, to think that something else is possible. it's not the rest of the world, it's the Western mind really that's created this, and it's secular. A lot of the major religions are really grappling, and they're making big changes. The Vatican and the Catholic popes. So they're really looking at how to fix this gaping
Yeah.
hole of a lost cosmology that is capitalism. It's just, it leaves people afloat.
Yeah.
So what do we do? What do we do? How do we get our minds, like, basically taking your book as like a starting place, as a platform to start creating new models,
Yeah.
and deconstruct and construct at the same time all facets of life.
I like Heidegger has this line which I wrote about in the 2012 book about his great essay concerning technology, and he said like it was about the worlding of a world. And our world is worlding this way. He says even this doom of the gods remaining absent, of the God remaining absent, is a way that a world worlds. So yeah, I mean that's like we're in a world. It's a whole construct, and we're going to flip over one way or the other. Whether it's too late or not, we don't know. But there are a lot of people awakening, and there are people who have tremendous resources, capital and cultural resources, who are awakening also. But it's a very interesting time now. And yeah, those other models just don't exist. I mean, I spent 6 years trying to start a company and a nonprofit. I started one, and getting the capital necessary to create like an alternative social network, to build this model of like alternative communities. We just couldn't do it at that point. It was torture, but maybe now it's going to become more available and it's deeper emergency. Yeah.
Okay, so I see like, there's like this kind of like...
Oh wait, hold on a second. Before I forget, I just want to, because I keep thinking about it and then forgetting again. Tomorrow night, I'm co-organizing an event at ABC Home on Union Square at 7 p.m. It's called What Do We Do Now? Build Another World. And it's going to be an experiential workshop and a kind of visioning exercise. We're going to talk about, get people to sort of break into groups and discuss, what their vision of another world would be, and then sort of come together and kind of like try to like cement that sometimes. Go ahead.
I'm like a little scatterbrained. I'm trying to like keep it.
Yeah.
Got my thoughts going. So like I see like emphasis on like capitalism as like this unstoppable like octopus like this or like this kind
Don't insult octopi. They're so beautiful.
whatever like all this like the thing the monster that keeps growing like cancer, I guess is a better way of saying it. And also on the other side of like this idea which I didn't really hear so much stated so much, but it's kind of implied where our individuality is sold to us.
Yeah.
Like where the revolution is the Che Guevara t-shirt that you buy.
Yeah, exactly. The system is hyper genius at like taking these kind of simulating anything that could be resistant to it and selling it back to us. Yeah, exactly.
Like philanthropy.
Right.
And the Trump takes over and guffs up the fluff. The Elon Musk or the Bill Gates comes in and starts putting out the charter schools. Whatever,
Yeah.
All of this, eats of like a closer and closer level of like a sort of like, I wouldn't say like a totalitarian or authoritarian, but I'd say a particularly effective, technocratic level of experimentation from the top down. You follow me?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's just not just from the top down, but it is happening. It's systemic. It's
The capitalistic urge, of like, say immigrants coming to the United States, looking for cracks and the holes in the system, to try to create new products, new ways of innovation, new forms of communication, expression, yada, 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 this, that, and third. Now, I also see like, combining, this talk of this notion of the rite of passage.
Yeah.
And also this fight against mass indoctrination, and so I see like a big kind of like I guess this kind of like problematic issue that sort of like popped up in my head where like okay, so there's this crash that's due, right? There's this issue off in the horizon. We know it's like this kind of like I can't say I don't want to say boogeyman because the problems are very real and the writing's on the wall in a lot of places.
Try to like.
Yeah, but I'm trying to condense it. So it's like, so you combine all these things, right? So I see this issue of like, okay, individuality being sold to us, capitalism being the driving force behind the social change, which not only gives potential for spread of information, but also the mass control, surveillance, and you know the influence of how language and identity affect us on a deep level. This idea of the rite of passage.
Okay.
Bottom line. Okay. How do you question now? How do you envision this kind of mass change could happen? I guess sort of like a paradigm shift towards, let's say, instead of like a growth-based model or like this like kind of human self-actualization of like, okay, I'm going to go, I'm going to make the money, I'm going to get the stuff, you know, I'm going to, you know, live for myself. I do switch that kind of individual focus, I guess, into a mass collective focus without, you know, I guess shoving it down people's throats first, you know, like, you know, Soviet Union style, without selling people individuality, you know, capitalist style, without, you know, having too much experimentation from a technocratic side where, you know, a lot of mistakes could happen that could lead to a lot of people starving. That's what happened in the Soviet Union and a lot of other places. Saying, overall, where is that kind of, I say, torpedo hole for the Death Star? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I tried to do with the book. In fact, I have an image in my mind. Like, yeah, it's a great question, man. I mean, you know, we're all in this together, right? Like, I'm not the answer man. You know, like, I mean, you know, one area that I find interesting to think about is this area of love and sexuality. Because, like, what do people actually want? Do people really, you know, so much of, like, particularly when you're young, so much of your consumption and your travel is about, you know, eroticism, you know, exotic and the erotic and so on. You know, and what I found fascinating about Tamara was by bringing consciousness into eroticism, it provides a model where people really are at home when they're home, you know? You know, so like what if you could have all of your, you know, particularly, you know, like, and if we look at what's happened politically, like toxic male sexuality is like a recurring like drumbeat under the whole situation, right? Like Trump and his misogyny and grabbing the pussy, and Bill Clinton and his philandering, you know, Roger Ailes, who just croaked, Bill O'Reilly, who just got discredited, Anthony Weiner and the sexting. You know, there's this like maniacal thing around masculine sexuality, and you know, and this repressive morality that we've been inscribed with, which is based on, you know, this monogamous vision and so on.
Are you saying it's because, you know, a lot of these kind of like delusional masculine ideas, a basic belief that masculinity is something that needs to be proved in order to display one's sexual value?
Yeah, I mean, we've created, because we're in this dominator society, you know, one main reason that men are forced to acquire, you know, excess wealth and fame and power is to have sexual access.
But I see like a true romance, like a poetic like outlook on life, you know, from every person just kind of sees the horizon in front of them.
What I'm talking about right now. Let me finish
Like a
what I was
poetic
saying.
sort of naturalistic approach where like instead of I have to bring the woman or whoever it is I want to sleep with, the coins. And I have a
Well,
big
everybody's
song,
inscribed to the
actually
system.
not. Here's
You gotta have to stop talking now. You talk a lot. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So is that like a leverage point? Like if you can, and we see a breaking down of the family, you know, monogamy. You know, we see like, you know, apps like Tinder, and you know, we see like the New York Times is looking at open marriages and so on. But you know, what Tamara did is really brought full consciousness into the whole situation. So like, you know, like I had a friend there who grew up there. He was